Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Christina Tang and I'm the Heritage Planner at the City of Windsor. I'm excited to welcome you today to the 7:30 public engagement session for our Windsor Archaeological Management Plan review. The AMP review project values your participation and interest. And while I'm here as the city's project manager, there's a team of us here who are also hosting this virtual session. So I have with me our archaeological consultants, the lead consultants from Archaeological Services Inc, ASI. We have Robert McDonald, who is the consultant project manager, and Martin Cooper from ASI. And we have our sub-consultant lead, Jacqueline Fisher from Fisher Archaeological Consulting. And on the City of Windsor staff, we also have Michael Cook, Deputy City Planner and Manager of Planning Policy, and Tracy Tang, who is also a planner majorly involved in this project. So for today's program, ASI will provide an overview and presentation of the AMP project for around 20 to 25 minutes. Then we will open the session up for question and answer. And we ask that you direct all of your Q&A type questions to the Q&A button at the far right bottom of your screen instead of the chat box. And you are welcome to type your questions at any point during today's session and upvote any Q&A questions posed by others that are of interest to you. We will be going through the Q&A after the presentation, so we are keeping your microphones muted until then. During Q&A, you can use the raise hand function to let us know if you would like to speak by microphone, and we will unmute you. You can also simply type in your questions in the Q&A box without audibly speaking into it, and we will address your typed questions. So this public engagement session will wrap up in an hour at 8:30, and you will receive a post-session survey if you have any interest in sending in any other comments, questions, or information to our project team. We will also provide the link to our project webpage where you can find the contact information for myself and Robert McDonald. And lastly, as part of the housekeeping, please note that this session is being recorded and we will be uploading the recording to our project webpage. So with that said, we'll first start with a simple poll of 2 questions, as we would like to see where you're coming from in your various areas of interest. So the first question is, which groups do you most identify with? And that's a multiple choice. So you can select as many as you want. So that's an Indigenous community member, or if you're a licensed archaeologist, land developer, development industry consultant, or you're government staff, or if you consider yourself part of a special interest group or organization, or if you're a member of the general public or others. And the second question, what are your areas of interest? So also you can select as many as you're interested in: archaeological sites, archaeological assessments, land development requirements, Indigenous engagement, policy development and implementation, metal detecting, general cultural heritage interests, or others. And we'll close the poll in a short time. Okay, so I think we're seeing here on the screen that it seems like the attendance from this session, many of them have attended a previous session already, so we're seeing the polling result from municipal staff, and there's interest in archaeological sites, archaeological assessments, Indigenous engagement, and the policy development and implementation side of it. So thank you for participating in the poll, and now I'll just hand the time over to Robert McDonald, the Consultant Project Manager from ASI, for the PowerPoint presentation.
Thanks, Christina. So I'm very pleased to be with you all this evening to discuss our update and review of the Windsor Archaeological Management Plan. The City of Windsor undertook the original management plan in the early 2000s, completing in 2005. And one of the key features of archaeological management plans is the idea of doing an update and review at certain intervals to take advantage of the fact that new information accumulates over time, and it's important to go back and take another look and in the light of new information and see if there's any adjustments that need to be made. At the end of the presentation, I'll go over the key components of the review, but for now, I'm going to just talk to you about a little bit about what an AMP is all about. So in Ontario, we have a fairly wide-ranging network of legislation that governs the management of archaeological resources. And AMPs fall under the purview of the Ontario Planning Act, which is one of the major pieces of legislation that calls for the conservation of archaeological resources. It does this through a document called the Provincial Policy Statement, which is amended from time to time. And this document really articulates most clearly the processes and procedures that municipal planners are to engage with in the process of doing their work. One of the elements of that is Section 2.6, which addresses cultural heritage and archaeology. So this is essentially built heritage, cultural landscapes, and archaeological sites. And as you'll note here, we have highlighted the fact that the province requires that no development shall take place unless archaeological resources have been identified and properly dealt with in advance of any land disturbing activities. Another important element of this section is the promotion of archaeological management plans as tools for municipal planners to help them decide when archaeological assessment work needs to be triggered as part of their development review process. And finally, I've highlighted the fact that under the most recent issue of the statement, which came out last year, it requires planning authorities to engage with Indigenous communities and consider their interests in undertaking archaeological and cultural heritage management procedures. As I mentioned, an archaeological management plan is a tool that is provided to municipal planners to help them make decisions about when to require an archaeological assessment in advance of land development. This is part of the development approvals process. So a developer will go to a planner with an application, and the planner has to decide if the application may threaten archaeological resources. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to use an archaeological management plan because it's a pretty straightforward yes/no decision based on mapping that's provided. The process begins with the compilation of an inventory of known archaeological sites. But of course, the known archaeological sites are just a small fraction of the archaeological sites that are out there on the landscape yet to be discovered. And this presents a significant issue for managing them in that they're invisible. And so really the way to address that is by creating maps that partition a particular jurisdiction into zones of archaeological potential. And this is done by creating models of where archaeological sites are more likely to be encountered and where they're less likely to be encountered. I'll provide more detail on how that works in a few minutes. The model is then tested against known site distributions to see how the predictions align with what we already know about archaeological sites. And another important feature of the AMP is the drafting of policy recommendations for how to actually implement and use the AMP tool. The process of producing an archaeological potential model or map is broken down into a series of stages, and it's an iterative or layered approach that begins by looking at Indigenous archaeological site potential. And you can see at the bottom here, that's kind of the first layer that we look at. And the reason we look at that layer first often is because it is really the one that has spanned the largest amount of time. There's over 13,000 years of Indigenous occupation in the Great Lakes area. And over that span of time, there have been many changes to the landscape that require us to look at how the landscape has changed and how Indigenous people have adapted to that changing landscape and moved their settlements according to the adaptations at any particular point in time. So it involves a lot of reconstructing environment to see how things have changed. It requires understanding Indigenous lifeways at various points in time, and it can incorporate traditional ecological knowledge from First Nations. So it's a process that's quite sophisticated and complex, and it's a great place to start by getting a handle on that. We then look at the site potential with respect to colonial occupation of the land. So this would be the settlement primarily beginning in the 19th century, but certainly in the Windsor area, extending back into the 18th century, and looks at historical maps, what we know about colonial sites and themes, and where things were located, things like mills and churches and residences and that sort of thing, to get an understanding of where archaeological sites may be concentrated. We then combine the Indigenous and the colonial site potential models to produce a map, which is a map for initial map of archaeological potential. But we then have to look at the integrity. And integrity is really the degree to which archaeology may have survived land disturbance activities that have occurred, particularly in the 20th century, from development of various kinds and also from natural things like erosion and so on. So you can imagine, for example, that a gravel pit would have completely erased any archaeological record that may have existed there. But surprisingly, certain activities, as we know, even things like house construction and that kind of thing, there may still be archaeological resources in things like yards and sports fields and other green spaces within the urban fabric that retain archaeological potential. So we really need to understand what the impact of the recent development is and understand integrity that way. So all those things are combined and they produce a potential map. Now, the importance of updating the AMP and why it's built into every AMP study that's been undertaken in the province is because, as I said earlier, information accumulates. And one type of information that has accumulated over the last 20 years has been archaeological sites. When the first AMP was done in the early 2000s, there were a grand total of 18 registered archaeological sites in the city of Windsor. Today, there are over 150. So clearly, there's been a significant growth in that number, and that those additional sites can really be helpful in informing us about expectations of where to find additional sites. This is a map that's just kind of a pixelated view of the city, showing rough locations of archaeological sites. And you can see some sort of trends here, for example, this kind of linear thing here. And what this is illustrating is archaeological sites that were discovered in the course of doing survey work in advance of the Detroit River International Crossing project, but other projects of that nature have also found sites. This is important because they represent sort of samples, if you will, of the city that can help to inform us about where additional sites might be found. I mentioned integrity. This is from the original AMP report, and you can see that this report identifies area of low integrity. It also talks about different historical areas of the city and so on, and various physical attributes that would have affected archaeological potential. All that's put together, and the final product in the original report looks like this. This is the map of archaeological potential for the city of Windsor. The areas outlined in green were identified as representing areas of low archaeological potential, and areas of yellow as higher archaeological potential. So one of the outcomes of the current review will be to review all the data, update it with new information, and see if we need to make any adjustments to this map. I'd like to talk now a little bit about some of the new information that we have, and some that's not new, but is useful to be aware of. And when we're doing the Indigenous archaeological potential model. And that's, again, as I mentioned earlier, the fact that the landscape has changed so much over the span of time that Indigenous people have occupied the Great Lakes area. So beginning about 14,000 or over 14,000 years ago, as the last ice age was ending, the vast Laurentide ice sheet, which once covered all of the Great Lakes, was receding. Meltwater was filling the Great Lakes basin, creating much larger meltwater lakes. For example, in the Huron-Michigan basin, we had a continuous body of water called Lake Algonquin. And so it's important to understand those kinds of things. And it's also important to keep in mind that this environment was much more like the boreal forest of today. It was a very cold and rigorous environment. And so the people were adapted to something quite different from what we're familiar with now. During this early time period, Lake Erie rose to an elevation above its current level, and you can see that illustrated on this map here. And this is a great example of something more recent. This is from a 2012 article, which provided a much higher degree of resolution in terms of our understanding of the lake levels in the Erie Basin and Lake St. Clair in that earliest millennium of human occupation. I mentioned that these folks were living in a boreal type environment, hunting caribou, which of course are no longer in southern Ontario, but they were also hunting extinct fauna like mammoth and mastodon. So again, that just underscores how different the landscape was back at that time. About 12,000 years ago, though, due to climate change and various other factors, the Great Lakes underwent a radical shift again and actually shrank to a much lower water level than we find today. And this low water phase of the Great Lakes lasted for roughly 6,000 years. So you can imagine that that would have had significant impact to anybody living in the Windsor area, because the Detroit River was likely either not there or just the smallest stream. There were probably wetlands in Lake St. Clair and the western basin of Lake Erie because of their depressional nature, but otherwise just vastly different from the kind of environment we find today. And here again is a higher resolution illustration of that, showing some of the residual water in the western basin of Lake Erie and just how vastly different and how removed from the Great Lakes this was at the time. This is important. This is important to remember, because one of the key understandings about Indigenous land use was that these were hunter-gatherers who tended to occupy base camps on the shores of the Great Lakes. And so most of those base camps, if they're on the shores of this lower level Lake Erie, would now be underwater and therefore unavailable for study. We also know, though, that Indigenous people practice a seasonal round. So they didn't spend their whole year at these base camps. They were there during the warm season, but in the cold season, late fall, winter, and early spring, they were dispersed into interior single-family hunting territories to basically spread themselves out on the landscape, make it easier to sustain themselves with fewer resources available in the cold season, and then come back to the lake shores in the spring. So there were certainly some occupation of the interior area. We can't think that these areas were not occupied, but likely quite a different sort of landscape than what we find later on. Even the natural environment, or sorry, the biotic environment was different as well. Up to about 8,000 years ago, after fairly quickly after the sort of tundra-like environment disappeared, and that probably happened relatively quickly, it was replaced by something that you would probably identify as being like a boreal forest today, something that looks like this top illustration here. But around 8,000 years ago, or by 8,000 years ago, this had transformed due to increasing temperatures and whatnot into the kind of northern mixed hardwood forest that we're familiar with in Southern Ontario today. We know that the Indigenous people adapted to this changing environment, different prey species coming in. Caribou were replaced by white-tailed deer, for example. Moose probably originally in Southern Ontario, and they gradually moved north as well. But we see that evidence of that reflected in such things as toolkits that they used for hunting, most notably the projectile points or spear points that you can see illustrated here, which, as you can see, evolve through time into different forms. And these forms are helpful to archaeologists in identifying different time periods, and from that we can tell where people were at different times and what they were doing. In the Archaic period, which was of hunter-gatherers, which lasted for many thousands of years, they were very resourceful hunter-gatherers, not only hunting animals for furs and things like deer and so on, but fishing was a huge preoccupation because fishing is a very rich resource, at least seasonally, particularly seasonally when spawning runs are occurring. But they were also harvesting wild plant foods, things like acorns. As you can see, these are carbonized examples of acorns up here, recovered from archaeological sites that tell us that they were harvesting nuts and processing them as well as part of their diet. So a very broadly based and diverse and rich economy. Gradually, the lake levels rose back up as the climate began to shift again. And the sites, those base camp sites that were along the shores of those early lakes, were inundated and are now unavailable for investigation. But we would see over time the gradual appearance of base camps on the current landscape. And in fact, the lakes, when they rose at the about 4,000 years ago, about 6,000 years ago up to this level, they actually exceeded once again the current shoreline. They reoccupied a lot of the earlier beaches and so on before finally dropping down about 4,000 years ago to the modern levels. And the reason that happened was because the Niagara River eroded through a bedrock sill at Niagara Falls that was holding the lake up at that higher elevation. So it drained down to more or less the modern level that we find today. So for a few thousand years, it was high again. And then for the last 4,000 years or so, it's been more or less where it is today. So again, understanding this pattern is important for recognizing changes in land use over time. The last major, I guess you could say, revolutionary change in Indigenous lifeways occurred about 1,000 years ago or so, when with the advent of maize agriculture. And maize, beans, squash, what are known as the Three Sisters, changed the economy by adding to and supplementing, initially in a small way, but increasingly supplementing the economy, the diet, and presenting the opportunity to become more fixed in their location and establish longer-term settlements and things like longhouse villages that you see here and so on. So that again was another innovation and change in the land use patterns that we see through time that we have to account for when we're doing archaeological management planning. This just illustrates some of the sites that have been mapped around the Windsor area from different time periods in the woodland period, and just referencing here the fact that wild rice was a really important resource in the shallow waters of areas like Lake St. Clair and the western basin of Lake Erie. So in addition to Indigenous land use patterns and changes over time, we also have to account for the colonial settlement of the Windsor area. So we look at where those sites are situated. And again, the original AMP did a great job of classifying different areas of important settlement at various points in time and identifying and flagging those for consideration. And we'll be reviewing that just to see if there's any new information that's been accumulated since 2005 that may help to be a little more precise in some of our understanding of some of that. So as I mentioned, all that information gets compiled into a potential map, starting, of course, because this is a review and we're not starting from scratch, we will be looking at this and seeing, does the information we have today suggest that we need to make some revisions to the potential mapping that you see presented here, and basically provide an update to that. My guess would be it would, but that's really the point of this exercise, is to see if we can refine this and basically bring it up to date with all the information we have now, and make it a more powerful tool than ever for helping planners make decisions. So to undertake the review and all the various bits and pieces thereof, we've assembled a project consultant team involving specialists from both Archaeological Services Inc. and Fisher Archaeological Consulting. We're very pleased to have Jackie Fisher, who was one of the leads on the original AMP, working with us on this project and providing continuity and also recent experience, because Fisher Archaeological Consulting continues to do a fair bit of work in the Windsor area. So it's great to have that expertise with us as well. So it's, as you can see, a team that covers a lot of different moving parts to an AMP, everything from environmental archaeology, policy and standards, and legislation and things like that, historical aspects, stakeholder engagement, Indigenous engagement, and geomatics, which of course is the GIS, the Geographical Information System, that is the powerful tool that we use to do the mapping and bring all the environmental information to bear on the questions that we're asking of the study. There's also a technical working group that the city has put together to assist us in this undertaking. It includes participants from the City of Windsor, several of whom are with us this evening. I know that Michael Cook, Christina Tang, and Tracy Tang are on the panel with me, but I noticed that Melissa Phillips, I believe, has logged into the meeting as well. So we're pleased to have her with us. We also have from the Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and Culture Industries, a couple of people involved in the project, and I noticed that Andrea Williams, who's an archaeological review officer, I believe, is also with us this evening. I know that a question came up in the earlier session about does this involve underwater archaeology at all? And Andrea Williams is the lead for the ministry on underwater archaeology. So I'm pleased to have her with us this evening. Just to answer the question, or again, that came up this earlier, it does to some extent. We'll certainly be addressing that to some extent, but essentially it's a land-based study because of its connection to the Planning Act and triggers under the Planning Act, which doesn't typically involve underwater things. That tends to fall more into the category of environmental assessments, which also trigger archaeological inquiry. But we certainly don't ignore the fact that archaeological resources can extend from the land into the water and vice versa. So that's also part of what we're doing. Another key person in the technical working group is Amanda Black, who's the president of the Windsor chapter of the Ontario Archaeological Society and a local archaeological consultant who's been a great help with local issues and things. And I've already mentioned the folks from Fisher Archaeological Consulting and ASI who are part of the technical working group. So to recap, the project objectives, update the sites database from the 18 that we started with in 2005 to over 150 now, and see how that can help us. Review the archaeological potential model based on all the parameters that I just ran through for you. Update the applicable legislation and things like the provincial policy statement, which you'll recall just was updated last year to make sure that we are in sync with everything that's out there and providing guidance for archaeological heritage management. Look at the implementation strategy. How is this used by planners in the current process? Because these things change over time, so we don't want to assume that the way things did things in 2005 would be exactly the same as today. And there's also been new things come up of interest and concern. Things like metal detecting is something that seems to be popular in Windsor. So we want to be able to ensure we capture everything that really is relevant to the Windsor situation. And each AMP is unique in its own right, and that's important to stress. Finally, or next to last, developing an Indigenous engagement protocol. As you will recall, the provincial policy statement requires that planners consult with First Nations. That is a fairly new requirement, but it's one that's been growing and developing ever since, in fact, ever since 2005. It's been something that's been developing in the province. And so we want to make sure that we have a protocol that aligns well with the protocol that the city is will be and is in the process of developing with Indigenous communities to make sure that those lines of communication are open and functioning well. And finally, increasing public awareness, because, and in fact, this public information center is an important aspect of that. An engaged and knowledgeable public is crucial to managing heritage resources, because neither planners nor archaeologists can be everywhere at all times. We don't know everything. The public is out there. They know things. You know things, and we want to make sure that everybody's aware of this, that the city's looking after archaeology, and that there's an opportunity to participate in that and support that at the community level. So we're roughly at the halfway point in terms of the overall calendar, but in reality, a lot of the stuff that's happened to date has been preparatory, basically laying the groundwork for the actual analysis and research. For example, there's been a huge amount of report rounding up archaeological reports that have accumulated over the last 20 years so that we can make sure we have the best information. So we're kind of at the perfect point now for talking with the public, engaging with First Nations and getting input as we begin the important work of doing the analysis and really the meat, if you will, of the process. But the engagement process continues essentially throughout. So there will be opportunities throughout this year into the late fall to provide additional input if anybody has anything they want to contribute or get involved. This is not the only chance, but this is an important opportunity to start engaging. Another way you can do that is by logging on to the Windsor Archaeological Management Plan webpage. This is a webpage that already existed on the city's website, but has been updated with tabs and new elements with respect to the update. So for example, the timeline, there's a tab for the consultation and timeline process. The steering committee and technical working groups, documents and notices will be posted here. And finally, the contact information for you to use to follow up. And this is the contact information you'll find here. So you can reach out to either Christina Tang or myself through these email addresses. If you have any information you'd like to share or any questions you want to ask, please feel free to do that. And so at this point, I will turn it back to Christina, and I guess we're going to start a question and answer.
Thank you for the presentation. And yeah, now we're open for question and answer. So yeah, feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box that's available at the far right bottom of your screen.
I know there was a lot of information we threw at you tonight. So if you don't have anything immediately springing to mind, as I mentioned, the website's available. You can reach out to us there. And please feel free to do that. And we're also recording this session, correct? So if there's anything that you wanted to hear again, I believe that you'll be able to access this recording on the website at some point in the future. Is that correct, Christina?
Yes, yeah, we'll be uploading the session.
If I could just add to that, and thanks for those comments, Rob, and the presentation. There was an earlier session. Some of you may have seen that as well. That started earlier this evening. So it too will be uploaded. So there were different lines of questions from the participants at that point. If anybody's interested in that, will also be uploaded to our website for anybody who's interested. So I just wanted to share that with any new participants in this session. So thank you. Yeah,
because this is the last component of our program for this public engagement session. So yeah, we're here and available to answer your questions. And then otherwise, yeah, you could follow up through our post-session survey or just through direct contact. Yeah, so if there's nothing else, we'll just like to thank you all for coming. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, we look forward to hearing from you through the post-session survey, or just directly contact us with your additional comments or questions. And if you have any more information that you like to know about, we do update our project webpage on the city's website. So thanks once again, and have a lovely rest of the evening.